Welcome to Tamonster Reviews. Today we're going to find out if you should revel or vile Circle of the Moon. And I'm going to make this first one easy for you. I revel in this game. Castlevania Circle of the Moon is underrated. Oh, wait, shit, no it's not. I do feel like this is maybe an underappreciated Castlevania title. I mean, look at this article. It comes in at number 20 behind 10 games that have scored way worse. This could be because it's more of a spin-off of the main timeline. The protagonist doesn't even use the legendary vampire killer. Instead, he uses a weapon called the Hunter Whip, which is functionally pretty similar, but doesn't have the decades of lore to fall back on. In that sense, it's easy to write this off as non-canon filler you don't need to play if you're looking for the definitive Castlevania experience, but that would be a mistake. Where Circle of the Moon falls short in its story, it makes up for it in its gameplay. In fact, it edged its way into one of my personal top 5 Castlevania games. Heck, maybe even top 4 if we acknowledge that Dracula X Chronicles houses 2 of the top 5. First, let's talk about the visuals. They hold up amazingly well over the decades, especially on the Switch port and the Castlevania Advance Collection, which is the definitive way to play the game, in my opinion. First thing you'll notice right off the bat is the protagonist. He has a simple design, but the green accents and his color choice stand out. It's not super memorable, but it's serviceable and generic enough to imprint yourself onto in the game. Like, at least for me, I could definitely feel like I was this protagonist. One of the first things I noticed about the game is the screen real estate the protagonist occupies. He takes up a surprising amount of space, but you never feel like you're lacking information on any enemy positions or things in the world map because of it, because you fight enemies that are similarly large in size, and they keep the map design a little bit simple so you don't get lost in the details of the world design. And to that point, on the enemy size, all the standard enemies you'd expect to see in a Castlevania title are represented and easily recognized on a first viewing, even though they have their own distinct style in this game. The colors in the Advanced Collection really pop on the enemies, so you're quick to identify any differences between some of the color swap enemies, besides just the moveset. And unlike some Castlevania titles where you may not learn the name of all the enemies you face, the game design helps reinforce memorization of what type of enemies you're going up against. There's a function in this game where every time you hit an enemy, its name will pop up alongside of it, which creates this unconscious memorization for what enemy you're actually facing. Before long, you'll find you've memorized the name of the color swap archdemon and beast you've killed 10 times, and have committed to memory the difference between a Lilith and the Lilin, just from the reinforcement of the names popping up each time you land an attack on them. Taking a look at the setting, the castle does have a notably simpler design overall compared to the castle in other titles like Symphony of the Night that came before, but the design does still convey an eerie feeling throughout the castle, even though it may be lacking in details in some areas. This is understandable though for me, because this is the Castlevania's first outing on the Game Boy Advance, and the design really does scream that. They weren't taking too many risks in the castle design itself, and I believe they were keeping it simple because they maybe weren't as used to the hardware, but of course that's speculation. But the castle does stay true to its horror-themed elements, or I guess spooky elements is probably more apt. I don't think anybody's ever been scared while playing a Castlevania game. I haven't, but hey, to each their own. You definitely feel the darkness when you get to later parts of the castle where you can see the sky outside. The purple hue that it can overcast really does give the castle that sense of darkness. The game's soundtrack assists with that as well. At the time, Circle of the Moon soundtrack was considered to be one of the best Castlevania soundtracks when it released, but I have to admit, I don't have the best ear for music. I'll play a little snippet for you here and let you decide how good it is. I did find that the soundtrack never distracted me from the gameplay, and that's really all I'm looking for. But it isn't without its little audio quirks. Whenever you enter a boss fight, the audio does cut out completely during the opening cutscene while you wait for the dialogue to take place. And there are some boss fights where there is no cutscene at all, so you enter a boss room and the boss fight is just happening. And that can throw you off a little bit, but it never detracted too much from the game, so I'd give it a pass. And I'll admit the story is pretty weak, especially since it's pretty much a standalone story for this game and this game only. And I feel like they knew that, so they don't spend too much time on talking before the music starts up again, to be fair. But now let's talk about the gameplay. Man, that gameplay is fire. And it's one of the reasons why I think it has to be considered one of the best games in the series. If we just talk about player control, the player does control maybe a little bit differently from other Castlevania titles. I've heard the movement be described as weighty, but I'm not sure I agree. Even if it is, I feel like you get used to it within like your first hour of playing the game. so I don't feel like it's too notable to talk on. I feel like you do get a lot of air control once you get used to the movement, and the main attack is snappy and responsive, as long as you aren't using a slower weapon, or especially when you compare it to the next game that came out on the Game Boy Advance, but I'll save that criticism for another video. The difficulty ramp is fairly balanced as well. The game does slowly get more difficult as you progress, creating real challenges in the late game to keep you engaged. For example, the arena as the main challenge stage at the end of the game, and there are just enemies that can take a ton of hits that you will need to grind to easily defeat before the games close. But that being said, you do find that you can progress through the game pretty quickly, but you aren't likely to find all the DSS cards by the end game if you rush through the main path. But I do think that giving you the option to pursue the extra DSS cards or attempt the final challenges, arguably underpowered, does make for a great player choice in how you want to experience the game. You can have that easier time by spending more time with the game, or just making it as hard as you would like it to be by rushing through as low level as you want to. I will give the game a knock for having low item drop rates in this game. You will have to kill enemies multiple times to see both of their drops. Each enemy does have 2 drops. But when something does drop, it does feel impactful. Items have significant impacts on your stats, and you can feel the difference each time you equip something, which I feel like is something a lot of classic action RPGs get wrong, and even some modern action RPGs fail to make stats feel significant, but it's definitely something you'll see in this game. Your stats really do matter. Like, honestly, tell me you really noticed what that tunic did to your defense when you equipped it to Sora in Kingdom Hearts. You didn't. You didn't notice a damn thing. And on that note, each of your character stats does feel really impactful. Even luck has noticeable effects in games. In a game where the drop rate is so low, they do this amazing game that other games don't really do for luck stats, which is help you visualize it. If you use the DSS card combination for luck boost, you actually see its effect every time you get an item drop. Your character will flash with a colorful circle around him, indicating that you got a lucky drop. That is something I didn't think a game could do, which is make luck visible. And that just makes things like the drop rates, even more engaging to interact with. And it's the same for if you have your damage boost on or your defense boost. Anytime you get hit, it will show you that defense boost is active by flashing on impact. So not only will you see you take less damage, but you'll also see that you had a little bit of help with each hit you take or each hit you deal out. It's little things like this I wish games added to make your stats feel more tangible. But talking about all these DSS cards, I should probably explain to you what that is. Like most Castlevania titles, there is a unique combat system in this game, and that is called the DSS system. Throughout the game, you'll defeat enemies and you'll collect drop cards from different monsters you defeat that fall into a type and effect category. DSS stands for dual setup system. So you have 20 total cards you can collect, 10 effect cards and 10 type cards, and you can take one effect card and combine that with any of the type cards to create an action in game. Whenever you press L1 to toggle the effect on or off. In the effect category, you'll find elemental cards like water, fire, thunder, stone, and in the type cards, you'll find things like weapon type, creating a projectile, creating bombs, summonings, and those type of cards. So combine those with an element, and you get different options each time you use that combination. You can combine them to create magical weapons or magical energy blast, and you can toggle whether or not your combination is active with the left trigger. And when it is active, you spend mana to use the effect. But for most DSS combinations, the mana impact is so low that most combinations you can use indefinitely to suit your preferred playstyle without much worry that you'll run out of mana. You'll get a lot of mileage out of the game, mixing and matching the different cards and trying to figure out what each of them does, especially if you don't want to look it up. And I will say, it did take me a while, but I did figure out that the game does actually hint to you which enemies drop cards. Whenever you hit an enemy, you'll see, if you see a question mark card by their name, that means you haven't gotten the card they dropped. And once I realized that, it became a lot easier to figure out which cards I was missing and which enemies would drop them, and that made the game more fun for me to engage with. But I will admit, since the drop rates are so low, it isn't likely you'll finish a run with having collected all 20 cards, unless you really want to overgrind the last boss. So I will say it's a detriment to the game. I think, I had so much fun figuring out what all the cards did. I can overlook that. One thing I do want to point out, though, is that this game understands game design better than titles that came before and after. I already mentioned how they make the stats feel impactful, but this careful game design persists into the combat as well. For example, one of my big gripes with Castlevania Portrait of Ruin and Bloodstained Ritual of the Night are the satellite spells that you can get early on in the game. These spells do constant proximity damage to any enemy close to you. You can also have defensive elements to them as well, such as nullifying enemy projectiles. In Bloodstained, you'll find that there's a rotating book spell that does this. And in Portrait of Ruin, the rotating icicle spells, which is one of the early ones you get in the game, offers this functionality as well. And the offensive and defensive properties arguably make these one of the contenders for the best spells in any game. And in both Bloodstained and Portrait of Ruin, you get the spells early on, and they make the games considerably easier throughout, especially in Portrait of Ruin, where the ice spell is like one of the first spells you get, meaning it has one of the lowest mana costs, and I found myself hardly ever switching off of that particular spell. Circle of the Moon mitigates this problem because it does have satellite spells, but they do considerably low DPS compared to other options you have in your arsenal. This does make them good defensive tools for bosses who spam projectiles, like Death, but it's not a preferred choice if you want to end a fight quickly. Whereas in the games I mentioned previously, it'd be hard to find a spell more suitable than the satellite projectile. And there are situations where you do want to use a satellite spell in place of something else. Even one of the later game DSS cards that lets you negate specific types of elemental damage, you might think is better than the defensive option you get from the satellite spell, but you may also not want to lose out on the slight damage that it does do. And this pro and con choice situation is always something you're juggling in Circle of the Moon when deciding what DSS card you want to use, and that's something I find really engaging about the game. Another thing I like about your standard attack is if you hold the attack, you will automatically spin your whip. I know free whip spin is something introduced in earlier Castlevania titles, but the auto spin is, I feel, way more useful than the free whip spin, because that was always a kind of janky mechanic in the games that did have it. I'm sure some people very much liked it, but just holding the button is way better in almost every way from a gameplay point of view. The only thing you're losing is a little bit of novelty. The hitbox for the whip is also really good. The hitbox starts slightly above your character, which makes it really nice for feeding projectiles that are coming right above your head just with like a single press of the button. It also helps with hitting enemies that are slightly above your jump height, since the hitbox starts above your head and then proceeds forward. This makes combat really fluid, and when you get the ability that creates elemental weapons, you'll find the weapon arcs for those have really good overhead motion as well. So you're never going to be with a weapon that, well, I shouldn't say never. I'll say you're hardly ever going to be with a weapon that doesn't cover the overhead space of your character, which is really great design for a game that has a lot of flying enemies. Let's talk about the level design next. The level design is what I would call safe. There is nothing amazing that stands out. There's a few puzzles here and there, and some optional platforming challenges. There aren't anything to write home about. What I commend it for is that it omits some of the worst parts of Castlevania game design. Another thing I wanted to highlight about the map design is how they hide items in the game world. They do a real good job of keeping items sectioned off to parts of the map you can't access or haven't visited yet, which is really important in a game where you don't have like item markers to be backtracking for. I feel like it's important to highlight, or based on the next title, I feel suffers in this area a bit because a lot of the items are hidden in areas you've already been to. And I know backtracking is a big part of Castlevania games, but there is an element of tedium that I think Circle of the Moon avoids with its map design. They usually hide items in areas that are inaccessible without a proper jump, so that part of the map won't be revealed unless you have that jump as well. And it's this extra forethought into how you design the levels that I really appreciate in Circle of the Moon. You won't find any rooms that are overrun with hard-to-hit fleas that are really no threat to your character dying, but are just annoying to hit. You won't find the dreaded room with rotating platforms with hundreds of Medusa heads that are going to mess up your jump arc because you'll fall to the bottom with a single touch because of the stone effect. I'm looking at you, Dracula X Chronicles. They do have these enemies, but they always give them to you in a manageable quantity, unlike other Castlevania titles. And you're usually always able to deal with enemies before attempting to jump, which can provide a nice break to platforming segment. You also get to double jump pretty quickly, so platforming isn't overly emphasized in the game, in my opinion. But that lets the strength of the combat stand out more, so I don't mind. One thing you'll see in the game a lot are these things I'll call combat halls. They usually feature repeated battles against 2 or more enemies that take several strikes to beat, and you'll have to master their attack patterns to overcome the entire length of the hall. Some may find those cumbersome, but I do like the repeated knowledge checks and the ability these gauntlets give me for experimenting with different DSS combinations, which I do think is the main fun of the game. And you can ask yourself questions like which DSS combination makes enemies easiest to overcome, and you can test your theory on one and then proceed to the next set of the same enemy and try it again with a different combination. You'll notice that the difficulty does seem to ramp up a bit faster than you are getting stronger, but I think that does just make the game last a little bit longer into playtime. You'll be challenged by this game as an adult as much as whenever the first time was you played it, if you're older like I am. If this is your first time playing the game, I think you'll definitely agree this will still pose a challenge for you today. It has that timeless difficulty quality. I like games where the base difficulty isn't too easy, and this is definitely one of them. The difficulty definitely seems curated, and it's tough, but there are many avenues to make your run easier or harder depending on what you want to do. You can always run past enemies, grind for potions, grind for new cards, grind for levels, until you're happy with the difficulty the way it is. But because it's not a game you can just easily run through, you'll feel like you've accomplished something by the end of it, and that's what makes this a great game to me. I'm clearly not the only one who saw something great in this game, but if you haven't given it a chance, it's a Castlevania game worth playing, and I would definitely say Castlevania Circle of the Moon is a game I revel. Thank you for making it this far. If you like this game as much as I do, tell me down below, and if you like the video, please like and subscribe. I'm out.